Today we are going to spend at least 1 hour talking about 5 broad topics. General background about your life and work, your reflection on your work, your thoughts about the relationship between feminism, scholarship, and activism, and how you see your work in relation to these practices. Your thoughts and insights about your work in the context of broadly conceived notion of women movement. And finally, the connection you see, if any, between your work and those of activists in other national settings. So if we start, we're starting with your background about your life. As you think about where you are today, how would you see the journey that brought you to this point? That is, what are the central commitments in your life? What does your career look like? What do you consider your most significant lifetime achievement professionally?
My central commitment, I think, is I'm passionate about issues of equity, equality, social justice, and in particular issues relating to gender equality and equity and women's empowerment. But I don't see it only as a gender issue. And that's why we developed the whole concept of transformative feminism to insist that we have to ground issues of gender in the relationship to class, neoliberal globalization, race, etc. And it depends also on the context in terms of how these relations intersect. And so I think I've been very fortunate that well, first of all, if I say how I came to this, of course, part of it is my own childhood, where I had quite a lot of struggles and felt very angry and thought the world is unjust. How do we change it? And later, I was exposed to literature that helped me to name what it is we're talking about. As a young person in the States, I got involved with the civil rights movement. And so when I came to Tanzania, it was a kind of continuity between struggles then over issues of racial discrimination, which I saw as an issue in and of itself, but related it to class. And then connecting that as I came to Tanzania, became a wife and mother, suffered sex discrimination at the university, connected to gender. And I must say that I deal from the literature as well. You know, sometimes you think it's just you yourself, and if your spouse starts telling you, no, it's one thing when you're together in the United States, fellow students, everything is great. When you come home and you're really situated in a very patriarchal society, you can be told, no, these are American ideas, you know. You have to get used to how things are in Tanzania. Reaching out to fellow women and finding out, no, this is an issue for all of us. And then when I began to teach at the university, beginning to and fighting similar types of struggles over patriarchy at the university, we began to read the literature together in groups, study groups. And I learned to put a name to a lot of these issues and recognize, as so many people have, this is not just an individual problem, a personal problem. It's not just one's husband or father or brother or what. This has to do really with social structures and systems that we can change. That's the other thing. I think many women feel like this is how it is, that it can't be changed. And so I became very committed to history as well, learning again from the work that others have done, and recognizing, for example, in Tanzania and Africa, what people call tradition and culture is not necessarily tradition. It's what the colonial authorities invented talking to male chiefs and called tradition. But in fact, you can find out in the past, women had a great deal more power in many societies. I don't want to romanticize, but definitely there's not one tradition and culture. And we know now how different actors will use and manipulate the concept of tradition in order to keep women down. And so I think that's where some of us get together and say, let's do new history about social relations of gender, patriarchy, class, etc., from the past, and discover what were those relationships like and how did they change during the colonial period and so on. Okay, one of the things that we also learned, because I can say that who am I? If I say, who am I?
Mm-hmm.
I'm an educator, an activist, a researcher, a writer, a wife, mother, grandmother. And I was fortunate to be employed at the university in the early days, the 60s, when it was a very exciting moment where there's a lot of discussion, mostly on the left, social movements, Marxism, and so on, but it meant it was a progressive moment, although very intolerant of any form of women's rights and patriarchy. So, I mean, feminism. So those of us who raised the issues were bashed. You're dividing the masses. But we learned in order to fight this kind of patriarchy at the university, as well as outside in society, you can't do it alone. I used to write poetry. I remember when I faced really discrimination in my first appointment on a temporary basis, whereas anybody else with a master's degree in Tanzania was hired as a full lecturer, etc. I circulated a poem called Sex Discrimination at the Hill, something like that. And in those days, we used cyclostyle paper. It was blue. My comrades, women students helped me to circulate it in Hall 3, which is where, in those days, the female students stayed. But what can you do? Eventually, that even got published in the daily, whatever was the English newspaper at that time. But you know, one person, you can be easily isolated. All the women in administration and academic, it was exciting because, and also it wasn't not just Tanzanians, there weren't many Tanzanians even employed in the late 60s at the university. So anyway, we learned, and I learned to breathe. Late 60s and 70s, bashed it as a Western concept. I think they wanted to label it as lesbian and all the rest, which in order to invalidate, to stigmatize what we're doing. So feminists would call ourselves gender activists, but we were feminists in terms of what we were trying to do. So we started the IDS Women's Study Group. Then we wanted to not just read what other people wrote about feminism or gender, male dominance, outside at the beginning, and then work that had been done in Africa. We said we can do it ourselves. And mind you, the IDS Women's Study Group was many people were not from the university, so we were actually mutual learning kind of a group. We decided, let's do our own research. We started writing research proposals collectively and so on. And when we succeeded through Ford Foundation to get a grant, the directors of IDS said, no, this resource is going to belong to the IDS. We decide in the Research and Publications Committee how it would be used. And we, as especially those of us who were academics at the university, were shocked. You mean to say that the way village government sees women's projects in the village can happen at the University of Dar es Salaam? And we fought back. And we were 30 people by then. We stood up to the directors, Moskini, some of them were and are very close friends, and said, sorry, we don't accept. And we found support outside, including Ford Foundation themselves. It says, keep your money first until we recreate ourselves. We created and registered as the Women Research and Documentation Project. So that's how the WRDP began. It began a struggle. For the first 10 years of its life, you can say it was a breath of fresh air. I was doing critical, exciting work. And then along came preparations for Beijing. And I was approached with others to prepare for Beijing, to work with other organizations. And we held 3 meetings in 92, 93. We created what we called the Facilitators Committee or something like that. And I was like the coordinator. And that gave birth to I'm only raising this, if I go back again, to my life and my career, because there is a question about your career, I don't see an easy separation between scholarship, academia, and activism.
Okay.
We, as academics, had to organize ourselves to defend our rights as women academics, or as women in Tanzanian society, or the global society. At the same time, I had the kind of courses, and I used the opportunity to shape them, which would allow me to introduce students, first in Department of Education, and then in IDS, Institute of Development Studies, to analysis of gender as it relates to class, race, neoliberal globalization, especially at the graduate level. And I was fortunate to become coordinator of postgraduate studies in education. Then I was invited to join IDS, same time as I became full professor. And I used that opportunity to start an option. And then through the Research Methodology Foundation course as well, exposing candidates to issues pertaining not class to the struggle against imperialism and all the rest, but connecting that to issues of patriarchy. So I write as well as teach, and I was able to do the kind of my PhD research. It's interesting because the idea of doing work on access to education for girls or women, which was the theme of my PhD, came from the Ministry of Education. As a researcher in the Department of Education, we were all invited to go to the Ministry of Education and ask them, what are the key issues you want me to study? And they said, we have two issues. And one is why parents are not educating their girls. And secondly is pregnant schoolgirls. The issue of pregnant schoolgirls is a bit complicated. I think I'm not ready yet for that. I'm not rooted enough to do that kind of research. But the issue of access is something that relates to the work I was doing even as a young person in the States. And so that became the theme of my PhD. Another interesting thing about that is the only time I did kind of survey research where I employed student researchers to go out and do interviews. After that, I've always been a participant in the work that I've done. It's mostly been participatory research. Some of it has been historical, writing life histories with people, but much of it is really participatory action research, which means you combine analysis and research with connecting with people that you're working with them to analyze the situation, prioritize, make changes happen. So you see there's a flow in terms of connecting analysis, which I firmly believe we must strengthen our analysis, the use of the literature, and so on. We have to be very well informed when we go work wherever we're going to work in the grassroots level with people, connecting that to some form of activism. As I've been saying of education, I love teaching. I really do love teaching. 2003, in a way, I felt as if even MA candidates were there to get a degree in a higher, you know what I mean? It's slightly changed by 2003 compared to the atmosphere of really wanting to learn and exciting debates that used to be there. But I often did regret sometimes later I wasn't still. Luckily, I was able to go back, having been the first, I was called coordinator, but director of TGNP in the late 90s. I came back as a principal research analyst or something like that for 10 years, 2004, 2014, and retired in 2014. So that was very exciting. And then I analyzed a bit about my writing because I love to teach. I also love to write. I love to talk to people, so I love to do research as well. And I really was a prolific writer as a young person, although much of it was never published. You know, if I write something and somebody says, can I put that in my book or a journal article? Sure. But if people start saying, oh, you have to change this and change that, I kind of get bored. But if somebody says, Marge, you present a paper in Morogoro at the Sokoine University of Agriculture, sure. Or will you give a paper at the learning session of HakiElimu? Sure. Because I think it's the social interaction, which is the one I like, which is also what a teacher knows in the classroom. So my list, if you look at my list of presentations and so on, it's much longer than publications, but I do have, I don't know, I think maybe 21 books or reports edited or else myself, co-edited, co-authored many articles. Yeah, most significant lifetime achievements. Well, you know, it's hard for a person to assess themselves. And sometimes I think in Tanzania, especially amongst women, we don't do enough of, in a sense, praising ourselves. We wait until somebody's dying or dead, and then we start praising them, not just women. I think it's something about our society. I remember when we attended a meeting in Nairobi in early days, in the early 70s, and people stood up and said, this is our professor, this is our PhD, this is our this. And people from Tanzania said, oh, we have those, but they never thought of talking about it because, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I do.
Or we have a writer, we have a poet, and so on, kind of praising ourselves. But if I now look back, so if you asked me 20 years ago, it might be different. But if I look back now, I would say, I think extremely important achievements now that for looking back has been mentoring younger or so-called junior scholars as and activists in the university, but also outside. Because when I retired, researchers would come look for me at TGNP and share their work and so on. Other people write to us, and I'm sure this happens to you as well, and ask for comments on a proposal or an article or advice on how to go about their work and so on. So all of that I consider mentoring. Sometimes we mentor and don't know it. When you're working together with people and you're not consciously think about it. My grandchildren, 2 granddaughters have just graduated from the university, and now it's a formal mentoring. Will you be my mentor? But you know, at University of Dar, Salaam, I think it hardly ever happened that way. It's just that people kind of get involved with what you're doing. You find them associating with you, and somehow you end up reaching out and supporting what they're doing. You may become close friends, you may do things together, and so on, and out of that can become that kind of mentoring. Another, I think, lifetime achievement is just having educated so many people. In Tanzania, wherever you go, hey, Mwalimu. I even my first teaching job was at Rosary Secondary School, now in Ghana, and I can still meet a graduate of that secondary school.
Wow.
And you know, it's wonderful when you realize how many people have been associated with you in that way. And you know, teachers learn from their students. It's not just a one-way flow.
Yeah.
I think the research that I've done is a real achievement, especially, I think the most exciting was the Kihacha work that led to a campaign on the right to food, land, and democracy. It was very exciting. It was really grounded locally. It really was participatory, where the grassroots activists were very much a part of the whole process and took control of it. And it led to a major campaign, but very few people. It's just how we had partners who supported us, including Soma and so on. So that we could get our message out to many people and achieve maybe having inspiring other people, because people say, you're Marjorie Mbilinyi, I've been reading your work. Or that article you wrote was very important to me. And some of the people saying this are people I respect so much, you know, including the kind of African feminist group in the diaspora as well as on the continent. So you don't even know sometimes that not just your presence, but the writing is like that. And I know from my own experience, having been so inspired by the writings that I have done. And I guess if I would conclude here, I think we need to continue putting a lot of attention, because there's so much social media stuff and all the on writing, on getting our message out. And I still believe in books, printed books,
Yeah.
that people can hold. You know, when Kihachi produced everything in Kiswahili, and villagers would devour these materials, they would finance photocopying them to take them to other villages. So I believe the written material still has a transformative role in communication. Thank you.
Thank you, Dada March. Yeah, I think you've touched the relationship between feminism and scholarship and activism that you've mentioned already.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we can move on to the intersection of your work with the women's movement in the country and globally.
Maybe I could say one point.
Okay.
There's a question about how have things changed over time. And I remember making that point at the university. We're encouraged to write.
Yeah.
Of course, I did get a formal letter from administration, chief at that time, chief academic officer. Maybe in the same, funny, because I was writing about women peasants, I was writing about education, history, and so on. But because it was connected to a gender analysis, they were saying it's the same thing. So I think at that time, people hadn't really recognized the fact that gender analysis is in itself a field of study, that feminism is a field of study. I think we've gone beyond that. But and so a lot of my work was also my own individual as well as collective. When I joined TGNP, you can see a drop in my publications. It's much more collective. It's also very exciting because when you write an article on behalf of the organization for the newspaper, and we were writing those every week. Either it's in the name of the director, it's the name of the organization, but it reaches many more people. And if you do presentations, you're talking to many more people. Even as an individual, you're talking to many more people, but it means you're not yourself getting your work published and so on. And I think as a writer, sometimes we also like to have our name attached to things somehow, something about, or maybe it's simply the art and craft of writing. When you're on the go every day, something's happening, you're writing something, it's a different kind of writing. I think it's it can be very influential, but it's a different kind of writing. And recently I was fortunate to be invited to participate in a project run by, it's called the Oxford Encyclopedia of African History. And within that, there's going to be a book edited by Dorothy Hodgson and other colleagues on African women's history. And they invited me to write a chapter on Tanzania women's history. It's taken me a long time, but I've managed finally. It's been submitted, it's been accepted, and I'm really happy because it forced me to read new work, not only about Tanzania, women in Tanzania, but elsewhere, and to be up to date because I was trying to recycle old writing that had never been published. I said, no, we want it up to date. But that was great. I learned a lot from that process. And it makes me realize that we need space as activists. So it's like saying, if I was an scholar activist for many years, then I was sort of more full-time activist when I was working full-time at TGNP. And now I'm a combination of everything, but independent sort of writer. I think even when we're full-time activists, we need to invite people. on their work, but also go out and learn what is being written about, what is the analysis going on concerning gender in Africa in 2021, what's happening around the world, what are the latest advances in feminist scholarship, because quite honestly, we don't know. If you don't read, you don't know.
Yeah.
Unless you have a chance to participate in certain kinds of meetings. So I do think we need to invest more time in reflection and analysis. And we don't have to go outside, but we need to have a break from everyday work, a place to be on your own and probably have some social contact to support what you're doing as well as financial support. So that's just one reflection. Yes, okay.
Yeah, so we go to number 5 on our guideline, the intersection of your work with the women's movement in the country and globally. I'm sure you mentioned that. Yeah.
Okay, so which question is it?
It's number 5. Number 5.
Oh, number 5. Okay.
Yeah.
We work with the women movement. Okay. Well, I had already started talking about it in the questions up above, but of course, my closest relationship has been for the women's movement has been TGNP. But I also mentioned Women's Research and Documentation Project, and also the FemAct Coalition, Feminist Activist Coalition, and also increasing working with a newer organization, Women Fund Tanzania, and from looking at what was created and supported by the combination of WFT and TGNP, which is Women in Constitution Coalition. And I am, on the one hand, I would say my work has been part of the movement, and I have been enriched by the movement as well as contributed to the movement. Recently, I am doing another report, looking at reports written by actors in that coalition, Women in Constitution. And then looking back at the work we did with the FemAct in the 90s, in the early 2000s, I'm really proud of what we've achieved. And in spite of changes that have happened, in the 90s, everyone was in the 70s, 80s, especially in the early 90s. You could say that there was a general progressive community that was critical of neoliberal globalization. Our first public meeting, open public meeting of TGNP was on gender and structural adjustment. And we got a deputy minister, Honorable Khan, to be the guest speaker. She stayed for the whole day. You know what I mean? It was something that many people, many women and part of being critical. Who are these World Bank and IMF to tell us what we're doing? We had a president then who was himself an inspiration and the whole regime. Well, now, if you look back at that time, at the present, I think neoliberal ideology is much stronger. It has affected organizations. Also, in those days, an organization like TGNP, development partners come to beg us, can we support your doing? And they were prepared to do what was called basket funding, program funding. We would give them a 5-year plan, they would support as well. The whole world has changed. We can't pretend to be an island. And there's much more project funding, which means that the donor partner, in quotation marks, is, I think, more in the kitchen now, having more influence on what we do. And an organization may end up doing a project, not because it's really a part of its own program of priorities, but it's where a funder is prepared to make the funding. And then what you do is to try to fit your own program into what that development partner wants. And I think that atmosphere, I can sense, if we look at Gender Festival, TGNP, every 2 years we have the National Gender Festival, and every year we have the local Gender Festival. It's a wonderful gathering of thousands of people in most cases, from all over Tanzania and also neighboring countries. And in the old days, we were all openly critical of the states, of government, donor community, all the rest. Whereas these days you see people saying, shh, be careful. And maybe we've invited the vice president to be the guest of honor or something. You see what I'm saying? There's a change in the
I can.
where we're beginning to think our partner, even our I don't know how to put it. I can't say fellow activists, but our high, powerful women political elites or members of the governing class. This is a change from how it was before. But we always out in order to try to influence, support, advocate our positions. Whereas now it's as if we want to be a part of that group. And by doing that, I think, let me pose this question. Have we lost our positionality in solidarity with the majority of women? Let me just pose it as a question. And I think it's a challenge for many of the organizations. Having said that, I remain very proud of what is being accomplished even today. We may all have differences, but somehow some of the organizations retain a sense that they have to speak out in support of popular issues. They have to be willing to be critical, and that's holding us together. I hope we can continue that essence of identifying with the majority of marginalized and so on.
Okay, thank you. Okay, number 6, connection to international forms of activism and scholarship.
Okay. Right. And then it says my other another group I want to mention along with, I have mentioned WFT, but another group I belong to in this more recent is an entirely different kind of organization called HakiElimu. We are a group of women who all have reached the age of 60 and above. I think I'm the oldest. Wonderful age of 70.
Yeah.
And we're just a social support. We just have fun. I remember at the beginning saying, now what we can do is lobby that we need to have spaces, community centers for Wazee. One of the members said, March, this is about us. This is about us, about what we want and need and so on. But actually, a lot of the time is spent having monthly lunches, hanging out together. At the same time, we have a very active WhatsApp group. So every day people are watching out, they're sharing things, including sharing the achievements they have had or their kids have had, grandchildren have had, other friends. If we notice somebody's silent for a few days, we reach out, hey, so-and-so, are you okay? What's going on and all the rest? With COVID, it hasn't been possible to meet as often as before. And that's really great. It's important that we have those kinds of interactions. I think some people get them through their church or their mosque. There's a women's group they're a part of. And may I mention another local group called Wakiko, which is Wanawake wa Kimara Kibaruti. It's a savings and loan organization in my old neighborhood at Kimarabaduchi Corner. A key leader of that is Veda Tumbo Masabo, but there are many other women involved. And that's another kind of association organization that keeps me grounded sometimes. I'm just Daramarj there. In the old days, we would meet every week. Again, with COVID, plus my moving to Masaki, not always possible. But I think you get the idea. There are lots of different organizations. That's international connections. I think, again, beginning in the late 70s, 80s, 90s, when there were more and more conferences and meetings on gender issues, plus the meeting in Copenhagen was the first World Congress on Women's Rights that I attended. And then I was a part of Nairobi. We organized, through WRDP, we organized the Tanzanian groups to go to Nairobi. I think that was 1980. TGNP became a key facilitator, those who went to Beijing, although I didn't go to Beijing. But I've been fortunate to have been exposed through those kinds of meetings, making contact with different networks, and those in do develop sometimes into rich friendships. Also having a chance to share our work and my work outside and hear feedback from other people, learn what other people are doing has been very exciting. And a lot of it has been this kind of cross section between academia, scholarship, research on gender and women, as well as activism. Because I think for many feminists, you can't really say this is academic, this is activism, because they are connected. I think some are purely into academia, especially recently, more kind of liberal feminism. But I think a lot of people in the 90s, like the organization Dawn and Award and others, connected scholarship and insisting on the voice of African women to speak for ourselves, people, women in Africa, to do analysis ourselves, the situation and the history and so on, has been connected to development issues in our societies. It was impossible to separate those two issues. There's another question that I somehow related to about connecting with the social movement. And I know in some meetings I've attended, like a week, it became a big issue. How do we connect women's rights movement or feminist movement with social movements for change? And it's interesting, it's often it's us having to reach out to them. I wish it was more of the social movement people wanting to know how to reach out to the feminists and include them in their work, to recognize the fact that really we provide a necessary ingredient in any social movement, because we connect the private and the public. We're not just interested in issues of class struggle and so on, but we connect it with the struggles in the home or struggles over the home. When our government says you cannot made an overnight decision that pregnant schoolgirls could not re-enter schooling, they were intervening in a private issue of sexuality and reproduction, something in the name of tradition that was not traditional. So you can see that, in fact, the government has engaged in trying to govern and manage the private as well as the so-called public. And the social movement people have to get on board with that issue. Like, they can't just talk about struggles in the workplace. What about struggles in the community, which supports workers or peasants in the workplace? I think you know where I'm heading. I think transformative feminism does this. We combine our analysis of sexuality, reproduction, to our analysis of exploitation and oppression in the workplace. And for many people, the workplace is not a factory or an office. It's doing home-based work in the informal sector, in the city or the town, or informal sector and peasant production. So that's social movements for change. There's a need to bring them together. And I remember when we first tried to analyze transformative feminism, we said, our movement is the movement that will bring really revolutionary change, because we do combine struggles over the home, the community, the family, with the workplace, something together like that. Over to you.
Thank you so much. I think in a way we have like finished, unless you have something to add.
We kind of started talking about because at the beginning, as I said, there was more interacting on a kind of individual basis. People might have read my work, they invited me to a meeting, or we got involved with meetings. When I joined TGNP, especially when I went back in 2004 to 2014, I was often sent to participate in international and regional meeting within Africa meetings as a representative of TGNP. And before that, it was I think more on account of the kind of work that I was doing. And as I've said, this kind of exposure, I've learned a lot. But then there's a question about how do you make sense of differences and similarities Can we look at that one?
Yeah.
Differences and similarities in the issues raised by activist organization. There are differences, even within Tanzania, there are differences, as I mentioned. I think increasingly we can talk about state feminism, liberal, which is more or less working within the government structures as it is, rather than trying to change them. Liberal feminism, which more or less says, let women have equal opportunity with men under existing neoliberal society, which means a few women will make it as successful entrepreneurs. Majority won't. There'll be cheap labor. You could also see how the issues being raised by feminists, including those who might consider themselves something like transformative feminists, partly depends on their historical context, their location. What are the main issues where people are? Some folks are really focused on issues of sexuality and reproductive rights. For example, I'm right now in Houston with my daughter. And there's a big issue in Texas because the governor has and the legislature have just made it practically impossible for a woman to get an abortion. They've deliberately created regulations to make it impossible. And they are attacking legislature in the past that allowed the women's rights to abortion on any grounds. There was no need to justify it. Whereas in Texas now is 6 weeks. It also means that citizens now have the right to police women or people. Somebody, Uber driver who takes a woman to a clinic for an abortion can also be fined 10,000 or whatever dollars. You know, it's what creating what people say is on attending the meetings in Nairobi. That was in 1980. That was 1985, I think, 1985. A big thing then in the West was what they called FGM, female genital mutilation. Women from Asia, Arab countries, Middle East, they fought back. Underdevelopment, or it's land grabbing, or it's women as cheap labor. These are our issues of priority today. You, on housing, would say, no, this is a major issue, which we now call in Tanzania, I think, of course, in Swahili is different, but female circumcision or something like that. And I remember the first time I went to, and I asked them, what are your major issues? And they asked me, aren't you interested in the issues of FGM? And I said, no, not necessarily in this. You're interested in that issue. I'm interested in talking. They said, many researchers come and talk to us about that. Now, that was in, when was that? That was in late 90s, 98, 99, 2000, 2001, 2000. And these were Tanzanian researchers or activists coming and imposing their ideas of priorities on young Maasai women. I asked them, what are your priorities? We get beaten, tunapigwa sana. Now, many times young women are married, you know, whereas people think of youth, young women in our societies, as we know, is it a third of girls under the age of 18 are already married? I think it is, like a third. So when we say young women, we shouldn't think these are young unmarried women. They may be young. Some pastor's society or not. And they said, no, we get beaten. What do you call? They say it's not jealousy, which is interesting because I think many of us think because if a man leaves, then another age mate could come and be with one's wife. And we look upon it with the eyes as if the woman is disempowered and has no choice of a sexual partner, actually we don't see it, that the woman may have her own lovers and make her own choices there. They said, well, we get beaten if a calf is lost or a cow has died.
Huh.
And that taught me so much because, again, we as researchers and activists need to be very careful not to impose what we think as priorities on other people. We need to go and listen. What adult education has taught me is creative listening. And it's something which is key to what we call uragabishi, or animation, to go listen to other people. So I think that's a major challenge, is how to listen to other people and find out in terms of positionality, and then be clear where you stand. Are you in support of those who are most exploited and oppressed, or are you actually identifying with the elites in a certain situation? Women are not the same. When we did that classical annotated bibliography, Women in Tanzania, myself and the late Ophelia Mascarenas, we began with that concept: women are not the same. So when liberal feminists say, oh, women unite, I don't get it, because we're not united. Some of us are capitalist exploiters. Some of us work for development partners who are finding ways to monopolize or dominate policy making decisions. And others are truly trying to work with the movements at the local level. And I guess a challenge to all of us is, where do we stand in those kind of arena of different choices? I'm going to take, I hope I came with my lozenges, what we call positionality. Challenging ourselves in TGNP, we used to talk about a lot of times, and then in work. And positionality, where do we situate ourselves in the context of ongoing struggles, really concretely? Because as we know, when you're working on to, like I remember one of our intensive movement building IMBC programs in one area, I forget where it was, but I remember Anneth Sangai of TGNP was one of the researchers. And that community learned that the Minister of Water, I think, was passing by in a motorcade. So they organized themselves, women and men, but it was a priority issue for women, to block the motorcade. And they put up big posters, handwritten, to say, Tulete Maji, bring us water. And they stopped that minister and his motorcade, and he's surrounded by police, probably FFU. But he chose to listen. He didn't choose to say, get rid of those villagers or so on. He stopped, and he listened. He said, what is this about? And they said, for 5 years, they promised us water. We don't have water. Our women, mind you, our women have to walk so many miles to get water. And he asked the engineer in the group, what's going on? Why hasn't that water been dealt with? And of course, by stopping that way, getting media attention, and the villagers know how to get media attention, which then get communicated in social media, gets communicated on national TV, and so on. And within a short time, that village got, is it only about struggles over getting water or electricity in a maternity ward? I know that's a big issue in many places and so on. I think we're doing much more than that through this animation work or participatory action research work. People are learning their citizenship rights. They are learning not to be afraid of challenging local government, central government, and making demands. The same with when organizations like TGNP have been active in gender responsive budgeting, working with communities to look at what the budget allocated for your local community, to track those resources. Did it go to our village? Did it go to our schools? Did it go to our health centers? It's not just an issue of practical needs. It is an engagement with the state, and it's demanding participation from below by citizens, and especially women becoming a part of that process to emphasize what they believe to be the priorities. I think that's exciting work that continues to be done through the kind of participatory action research that is going on, just like creating knowledge centers, working with investigative journalists, where the journalists can go to a district health officer and ask them, we understand in such a ward, they have no electricity in their maternity ward. Now, if villagers raise that issue, they can be silenced by that district health officer. When a journalist goes with a camera behind them, they're going to pay attention and they're going to act. So that combination of doing this kind of participatory action research analysis involving grassroots people, community activists, combining it with the media, and then reaching out, giving feedback to leaders of local and central government, has really succeeded in making change. We might say that our previous government was not open to dissent, was not willing to accept activists of different kinds, even writers. So people began to be quiet and not to write publicly, speak publicly as openly as before. And that affected, I think, again, when I was talking before about changes in organizations, there's no doubt that that constriction of space for open discussion also affected our organizations, our activism. We had to find another language to say what we wanted to say, but it didn't silence us. I think people found ways and continue to find ways. People use cartoons, they use comedy, social media couldn't be silenced, but now I think there's another opening, I hope, that continues to provide space, and we need to take advantage of that space as feminist activists and reach out, as they say, broaden the envelope and inspire young people and be inspired by young people. I was just quoting that wonderful meeting that we had with the General Under Secretary General who leads the UN Women at the United Nations. You know, remember she had that meeting at TGNP. It was organized by TGNP and WFT. I forget the exact date, but just a couple of years ago. And the young feminists spoke out and said, we need more space for young people. And some of these are very notable, successful leaders of organizations. They're writers. They also made the point to be us young people to you old people, because we know about social media and IT communications, and you older folks don't. So that's a very important point, because I think for some of us who could think of ourselves as the pioneers of the women's movement in Tanzania, we do have a bit of more, and we people in the movement as well as old and young people involved with community action. So maybe I end at that point. We have so much to learn from. It's wonderful to be invited to speak as one of the pioneers, older people, and if maybe another lifetime achievement I would say is not just me, but the way in which those of us who began organizing as scholar activists and creating space for raising feminist issues, that was a major achievement, which continues. But we also need to reach out and learn from young people. That to me is intergenerational transmission, not we teaching young people, but also working with young people is what keeps us alive, keep us younger and dynamic. How can you grow old when you're working with young people?
For sure. Good point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you have any of your own questions?
No, I don't really. I'm excited to hear what you're saying. I've always been, because it's like recalling what we had our last conversations. Okay, Marge, I thank you so much for your time. I know you have very busy schedule.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure as always. And it's nice to be able to see you